Sometimes a man can win every battle and still lose his soul. At 58, Viking chieftain Jorund has spent 30 years fighting, but he's never felt more alone. He's feared across the frozen fjords of Scandinavia. His sword has carved legends in blood. His name makes enemies tremble. But during a village raid, he captures a young healer named Solveig, who changes everything. She doesn't fear his scars or his reputation. Instead, she tends to his wounds with gentle hands. For the first time in decades, this hardened warrior feels something he thought was dead hope. Their bond grows in secret, away from the brutal world of Viking warfare. But when an old enemy threatens to destroy everything, Jorund faces his greatest battle yet. Can a man who has known only violence find redemption in love? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mist clung to the fjord like the breath of sleeping gods, rolling between towering cliffs that had witnessed countless seasons of war and peace. In the gray dawn light of late autumn, the landscape spoke of endurance weathered stone, ancient, pines bent by centuries of Nordic winds, and waters so deep they held the reflections of both sky and memory. Jorund Eriksson stood at the prow of his longship, watching the familiar coastline emerge from the morning haze. His weathered hands gripped the carved dragon head that crowned his vessel's bow, fingers tracing wood worn smooth by 30 years of voyages. The battle-worn axe at his side had tasted more blood than he cared to count, its iron head nicked and scarred from countless encounters. Each mark told a story of survival, conquest, and the gradual hardening of a man's heart thought behind him. 24 warriors pulled at their oars with the mechanical precision of men who knew that rhythm meant life. These were not the 100 fierce raiders who had followed him across the North Sea just months ago. Disease, desertion, and defeat had whittled his force down to this loyal remnant men too old, too wounded, or too bound by oath to abandon their chieftain, even as his star dimmed. "The men grow restless, Jorund," came a gravelly voice from behind him. Ragnar the Red, his second in command, approached with the careful steps of a man whose right leg had never quite healed properly from a Saxon spear. At 45, Ragnar was younger than his chieftain, but looked older, his face mapped with scars and his red beard streaked with premature gray. "They whisper that the gods have turned their faces from us." Jorund didn't turn around. Let them whisper. "The gods favor the bold, not the frightened." "Boldness without wisdom is folly," Ragnar replied, settling beside him with a grunt. "That last campaign is over." The finality in Jorund's voice could have cut steel. They both knew the truth of it. The raid on the Frankish monastery had been a disaster. What should have been an easy prize had turned into a bloody trap, costing them half their men and nearly all their treasure. The abbot had been cleverer than expected, and Jorund's reputation for invincibility had taken its first serious blow in decades. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the mist, and revealing the coastline in sharp detail. Scattered along the shore were the wooden halls and workshops of various settlements, each one a testament to the complex web of alliances and enmities that defined their world. Some would welcome Jorund's return with feast and celebration. Others might bar their doors and send messengers to his enemies. There, Jorund pointed toward a narrow inlet where smoke rose from hidden chimneys. "Solveig's village. We need supplies before we reach home." Ragnar squinted at the distant settlement. "Solveig's been neutral in our conflicts. His people are healers and farmers, not warriors. Why would they refuse us trade?" "Because neutral men have the luxury of choosing their friends." Jorund's voice carried the weariness of a man who had made too many enemies over too many years. "And we are no longer the sure bet we once were." The village of Solveig sat in a natural harbor, protected by wooded hills and blessed with fresh water from a mountain stream As their longship approached, Jorund could see the daily rhythms of peaceful life: fishermen mending nets, women tending gardens despite the late season, children playing near the water's edge. It was a world he had once known, before war became his profession and violence his currency. Among those moving through the village streets was a figure that caught his attention, a young woman with hair the color of wheat at harvest time, carrying a leather satchel that seemed to mark her as someone of importance. Even from this distance, there was something in her bearing that spoke of confidence and purpose, qualities that had become rare in Jorund's increasingly isolated existence. "That one there," he said, nodding toward the shore. "The healer with the herb pouch. She moves like she owns the village." Ragnar followed his gaze and shrugged. "Probably Solberg's daughter, or his prize healer. These peaceful folk always value their medicine women above their warriors." Backwards thinking, if you ask me. But Jorund found himself studying her movements with the eye of a tactician. There was no fear in her posture as their dragon ship approached, only careful attention. Most villagers would be running by now, or at least gathering weapons and preparing defenses. This one simply watched, as if measuring them against some internal standard. The woman Solveig, though he didn't yet know her name, had indeed noticed their approach. At 26, she had lived through enough raids and trading visits to recognize the difference between a merchant vessel and a warship. This was clearly the latter, though something about its crew suggested weariness rather than aggression. The ship rode low in the water, not with treasure, but with the weight of disappointment, and the men she could see looked more like survivors than conquerors. Her healing pouch contained the tools of her trade: herbs for fever, salves for wounds, and the small sharp knives necessary for surgery. She had tended to the aftermath of Viking raids before, though usually as they departed rather than arrived. The irony was not lost on her that the men who created wounds and the women who healed them existed in the same world, bound together by the cycles of violence and recovery that defined their age. "Solveig," called her friend Astrid from across the village square. "Should we hide the children?" She considered the question seriously. The approaching ship flew no banner she recognized, and its dragon figurehead was carved in the old style favored by chieftains from the outer fjords. But something in the way it moved slowly, almost hesitantly, suggested this was not a typical raid. "Not yet," she replied. "But gather the healing supplies. If they come for trade, we'll need to tend whatever wounds they're carrying. If they come for plunder, well, we'll need the supplies for ourselves." As the longship's keel scraped against the pebbled beach, Jorund found himself oddly reluctant to give the order to disembark. This moment felt different from 1,000 others like it, though he couldn't say why. Perhaps it was the weight of recent failures, or the growing awareness that his reputation alone might no longer be enough to ensure cooperation from neutral settlements. The village chief, Solveig, approached the beach with the careful diplomacy of a man who had survived by reading the moods of dangerous visitors. He was perhaps 60, his beard gone completely white, but his eyes remained sharp and assessing. Behind him came a small delegation of village elders, and Jorund noted with interest the healer woman with her leather satchel. "Jorund Eriksson," Solberg called out as the Viking chieftain stepped onto the beach. "Your reputation precedes you. Though the stories vary greatly depending on who tells them. Stories always do," Jorund replied evenly. "I come seeking trade, not trouble. My men need supplies, and we have silver to pay for them." This was technically true, though the amount of silver remaining in their possession was embarrassingly small. Still, the ritual of negotiation required certain courtesies, and Jorund had learned long ago that even the most feared warrior occasionally needed to play the diplomat. Solveig stepped forward slightly, her attention fixed not on Jorund's words, but on the way he carried himself. She had seen enough wounded men to recognize the signs: the slight favor of his left side, The way his right hand occasionally flexed, as if working out stiffness, the careful way he held his shoulders. This was a man in pain, though he wore it like armor. "Your men look like they've seen hard fighting," she said, addressing Jorund directly rather than speaking through the village chief. It was a breach of protocol that caused several of the elders to shift uncomfortably, but her tone was matter-of-fact rather than challenging. "If you're seeking trade, perhaps healing services should be part of the bargain." Jorund's eyes met hers for the first time, and he felt an odd jolt of recognition. Not that he had seen her before. He was certain he hadn't, but something in her direct gaze reminded him of qualities he had once valued in himself. Courage without foolishness, strength without cruelty, purpose beyond mere survival. "What makes you think we need healing?" he asked, though even as he spoke, he was aware of the infected wound beneath his chainmail, the result of a Frankish blade that had found its mark 3 weeks ago. "Because every warrior needs healing," she replied. Simply, the question is whether they're wise enough to accept it. Ragnar stepped up beside his chieftain, his hand resting casually on his sword hilt. "Bold words from a village girl," he said, though there was more curiosity than threat in his voice. "Bold truths from a village healer," Solveig corrected, unimpressed by the implied menace. "I've sewn up enough warriors to know that pride heals no wounds and feeds no men. If you've come for trade, let's trade. If you've come for trouble, well, you'll find we're not as helpless as we might appear." As if to emphasize her point, Jorund noticed movement among the trees on the hills above the village. Not many men, but positioned well for defense. Solveig might prefer peace, but he wasn't naive about the requirements for maintaining it. Trade it is, Jorund decided, though part of him wondered if he was making the choice for practical reasons, or because he found himself reluctant to threaten this particular village. "We need food, ale, and—" he paused, his wounded side sending a sharp reminder of pain through his torso. "Perhaps some healing services as well." The negotiation that followed was conducted with the careful courtesy of people who understood that words could prevent bloodshed. Jorund's remaining silver would buy enough supplies to see his men through several more weeks, while Solveig's skills could address the various wounds and ailments that had accumulated during their difficult campaign. As the day progressed and the formal trading began, Jorund found himself watching the healer work. She moved among his men with professional efficiency, cleaning wounds, mixing salves, and offering practical advice about recovery. What struck him most was her complete lack of fear. She treated Viking raiders with the same calm competence she would bring to treating any injured person, as if violence was simply another form of disease to be cured rather than a fundamental aspect of human nature. When she finally approached him personally, carrying a bowl of steaming water and strips of clean cloth, Jorund felt an unfamiliar reluctance to appear vulnerable. "The wound under your mail," she said without preamble. "It's infected. I can smell it from here, and the way you're holding yourself tells me it's causing significant pain." "It's nothing," he replied automatically. "Everything is something to a healer," she said, setting down her supplies. "An infection left untreated becomes something much worse. Would you rather die of pride or live to fight another day?" The question hung in the air between them, and Jorund realized that it cut deeper than she might have intended. Recently, he had begun to wonder if pride was indeed all he had left, and whether that would be enough to sustain him through whatever remained of his life. Slowly, he began to remove his chainmail. The attack came at dawn, 3 days after the trading had concluded. Jorund had planned to depart the previous morning, but the healing process had taken longer than expected. His infected wound required daily cleaning and fresh bandages, and several of his men had developed fevers that Solveig insisted needed careful monitoring. The delay chafed at him. Every day spent in one place was a day his enemies could use to track him down, but he couldn't deny that her treatments were working. He woke to the sound of horns echoing across the water, a signal that made his blood run cold. 3 long blasts, a pause, then 3 more. It was the call that meant only one thing: hostile ships approaching in force. From his sleeping place near the beach, Jorund could see them emerging from the morning mist. 4 longships flying the raven banner of Jorund the Black. His oldest enemy had finally found him, and in the worst possible position. Jorund's own ship was beached and would take precious time to launch. His men were scattered throughout the village, and they were outnumbered 3 to 1. "Ragnar!" he shouted, grabbing his battle axe as he struggled into his mail shirt. The movement sent fire through his healing wound, but there was no time for caution now. "Gather the men. We defend from shore." But even as he gave the orders, Jorund knew the mathematics of the situation were hopeless. Hjalmar had brought over 100 warriors, while Jorund could field barely 24. The village had perhaps 30 men capable of fighting, but they were farmers and fishermen, not battle-hardened raiders. The iron shackles he carried at his belt, tools for taking prisoners rather than killing them, felt suddenly heavy with possibility. This was no longer about victory or defeat. It was about survival and what prices he was willing to pay for it. Solveig emerged from her dwelling as the war horn sounded again. Closer now. She carried her healing pouch and moved with the purposeful calm of someone who had learned to function during crisis. Around her, the village erupted into controlled chaos as people gathered valuables, secured livestock, and prepared for whatever was coming. "They're not here for the village," she said, reaching Jorund's side as he finished arming himself. "Are they?" "No," he admitted, his eyes fixed on the approaching ships. "They're here for me." The honesty of the admission surprised them both. In his younger days, Jorund would have deflected blame, made grand speeches about honor and fate. But something about this woman's direct gaze seemed to strip away the comfortable lies he usually told himself. "Then perhaps you should give them what they want," she said quietly. He looked at her sharply, searching for mockery or calculation in her expression. Instead, he found something worse: genuine concern for the people who would suffer if this became a full battle. "You would have me surrender myself to save your village? I would have you consider whether your pride is worth more than their lives," she replied, nodding toward the villagers preparing for siege. Among them were children, elders, people whose only crime was living in a place where Jorund had chosen to seek shelter. The first of Hjalmar's ships ground against the beach with a sound like grinding teeth. Warriors poured over the sides, there, weapons gleaming in the early light, their war cries echoing off the surrounding hills. At their head strode Hjalmar himself, a giant of a man with arms like tree trunks and a beard braided with silver rings. "Jorund the Feared," Hjalmar's voice boomed across the beach. "Come out and face the reckoning you've avoided for too long." Behind Hjalmar came men Jorund recognized from a dozen different conflicts, warriors who had served various chiefs over the years, but who all shared one common trait. They had grievances against Jorund Eriksson. This wasn't just a raid. It was a settling of accounts. "I offer single combat," Jorund called back, knowing even as he spoke that Hjalmar would never agree. This had gone beyond personal honor into something larger and more destructive. Hjalmar's laugh was like the sound of breaking stone. "Single combat? You lost that right when you burned my hall and slaughtered my sworn men. Today you face judgment, not sport." The first arrows began to fly, and Jorund realized that negotiation was over. He turned to find Solveig still standing beside him, her hands now busy preparing bandages and setting out her surgical tools with the efficient movements of someone who understood that battle and healing were 2 sides of the same terrible coin. "Get to safety," he ordered, but she shook her head. "There is no safety in war," she replied. "Only choices about where to make your stand." The battle that followed was brief, but vicious. Jorund's men fought with the desperate fury of cornered wolves, while the villagers showed more courage than anyone had expected. But courage without numbers and experience could only accomplish so much. One by one, Jorund watched his loyal warriors fall under the weight of superior force. Ragnar took a spear thrust to the chest while trying to protect the village chief. Young Eric, barely 20 and new to Jorund's service, died with a sword in his hand and defiance on his lips. The beach became slick with blood and littered with the broken weapons of desperate men. Through it all, Solveig moved like a ghost among the wounded, dragging fallen men to safety regardless of which side they had fought for. Jorund saw her pull one of Hjalmar's warriors away from the water's edge, applying pressure to a stomach wound with the same dedication she had shown his own men. "Enough!" Jorund roared, throwing down his axe as the last of his warriors fell. The iron shackles at his belt caught the morning light as he raised his hands in surrender. "Enough! I yield." The fighting stopped with shocking suddenness. Hjalmar approached slowly, his sword still drawn but lowered. Around them, the surviving members of both forces began the grim work of sorting the living from the dead. "Finally," Hjalmar said, his voice thick with satisfaction. "The great Jorund Eriksson learns humility. What are your terms?" Jorund asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Death, of course, but not quickly and not cleanly. You've earned a more creative ending than most." It was then that Solveig did something that surprised everyone present, including herself. She stepped between the two chieftains, her medical supplies scattered around her feet, her hands and clothes stained with blood from treating the wounded. "I claim right of ransom," she announced, her voice carrying clearly across the beach. Both men stared at her as if she had sprouted wings. The ancient right she invoked was rarely used and almost never by women, but it was legally binding under the old laws that governed disputes between chieftains. "You?" Hjalmar's confusion was evident. "You would ransom this butcher?" "I would. Purchase his life," she confirmed, though her voice trembled slightly. "Name your price." Hjalmar's eyes narrowed as he studied her more carefully. And what could a village healer possibly offer that would equal the pleasure of watching Jorund die slowly? "Service," she said simply. "A healer's service, freely given, for whatever time you deem appropriate." The offer hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Jorund felt something crack inside his chest that had nothing to do with his physical wounds. This woman, this stranger who owed him nothing, was offering to sacrifice her freedom for his life. "No," he said hoarsely. "I forbid it." "You have no voice in this matter," Hjalmar said, though his attention remained fixed on Solveig. "The offer intrigues me, healer. But why would you make such a bargain for a man you barely know?" Solveig looked directly at Jorund as she answered, and he saw something in her eyes that he couldn't quite name. Not love, not even affection, but perhaps recognition of something valuable that shouldn't be carelessly destroyed. "Because," she said quietly, "everyone deserves a chance to become something better than what they've been." Hjalmar considered this for a long moment, his gaze moving between the healer and his defeated enemy. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Very well, but I modify the terms. I'll take you both, the healer, as freely offered, and Jorund as my prisoner. Perhaps watching you serve will teach him something about the price of his choices." As the iron shackles closed around Jorund's wrists, he met Solveig's eyes and saw his own reflection there. A man who had spent 30 years becoming something terrible, now faced with the possibility that it might not be too late to become something else. The cold metal against his skin felt like both an ending and a beginning. The journey to Hjalmar's stronghold took 3 days by ship. 3 days during which Jorund learned what it meant to be truly powerless for the first time in decades. The shackles around his wrists were more than mere restraint. They were a constant reminder that his fate now rested in other hands. He sat in the belly of Hjalmar's flagship, surrounded by warriors who had once feared his name. and now looked upon him with the casual indifference reserved for defeated enemies. Solveig sat nearby, unshackled, but clearly a prisoner nonetheless. She had been given a place among Hjalmar's own belongings, a position that spoke to the value placed on her bargain. The carved wooden cross that hung around her neck caught the light whenever she moved, and Jorund found himself staring at it more often than he cared to admit. The cross represented everything that separated their worlds: her faith in mercy and redemption, his belief in strength and vengeance. Yet here they were, bound together by circumstances neither had chosen, facing an uncertain future that would test both their philosophies. "You didn't have to do it," he said during their second night at sea, when the sounds of the crew's conversation had died down to a murmur. Solveig looked up from the torn sail she was mending. Even as a prisoner, she found ways to make herself useful. "Do what?" "Invoke the right of ransom. You could have let Hjalmar have his revenge and walked away safely." She set down her needle and considered his words carefully. Could I have? Could anyone truly walk away safely from watching another human being tortured to death, knowing they had the power to prevent it? Most people could, Jorund replied with the bitter certainty of experience. Most people do, every day. Then, perhaps most people are smaller than they could be. The simplicity of her response irritated him in ways he couldn't fully explain. She spoke as if goodness were a choice anyone could make, as if the world hadn't already divided people into predators and prey long before they drew their first breath. "You know nothing about the kind of man I am," he said, his voice carrying an edge of warning. "The things I've done. I know you're the kind of man who surrendered rather than let innocents die in a hopeless battle." She interrupted. "I know you carry guilt that weighs heavier than your armor. And I know that guilt comes from somewhere men without conscience don't suffer from their choices." Jorund stared at her, unsettled by her certainty. "You think you can read men's souls from their wounds?" "I think wounds tell stories. Yes. Your body carries scars from 100 battles, but the deepest injuries aren't on your flesh." She touched the wooden cross at her throat, a gesture that seemed unconscious. "My faith teaches that redemption is possible for anyone willing to seek it, even especially those who believe themselves beyond saving." "Your faith," Jorund said, nodding toward the cross. "The white Christ and his messages of peace. How does a follower of such beliefs justify living among warriors and raiders?" Solveig's smile held sadness rather than humor. "The same way a man who once knew love and family justifies spending 30 years perfecting the art of causing pain. We do what we must to survive in the world as it is, while hoping for the strength to help it become what it should be." Her words hit closer to home than Jorund cared to admit. There had been a time so long ago it felt like another lifetime when he had fought for more than conquest and glory, when protecting his family and people had given meaning to the violence, making it a tool rather than an end in itself. "You know nothing about my family," he said, but the words lacked conviction. "I know they existed," she replied gently. "I saw how you looked when you spoke of protecting innocence. That kind of pain comes from losing something precious, not from never having it at all." The conversation was interrupted by Ragnar's voice from the ship's other side. Jorund's second-in-command had survived the beach battle with serious wounds, but was now well enough to offer commentary on their situation. "She speaks pretty words," Ragnar said, his voice weak but sardonic. "But words won't change what Hjalmar has planned for us. You know his reputation, Jorund. He keeps prisoners alive for sport, not mercy." Solveig looked between the two men, seeing the resignation in Ragnar's eyes and the carefully controlled fear in Jorund's. "Then we'll have to prove our value beyond sport," she said practically. "Hjalmar is a warrior, but he's also a leader. Leaders need useful people, and both of you have skills worth preserving." "What would you know about leading warriors?" Ragnar scoffed. "Nothing," she admitted freely. But I know about managing difficult people, about finding ways to make enemies into allies, about convincing stubborn men to accept healing they don't think they need. Leadership and healing, they're not so different. Jorund found himself studying her profile as she spoke. There was steel beneath her gentleness, a kind of strength he was only beginning to recognize. She had walked into a battle between chieftains and emerged with exactly the outcome she wanted. Not through force, but through understanding the motivations of dangerous men. "Why did you really do it?" he asked suddenly. "The ransom." "What did you hope to gain?" She turned to face him fully, and in the lamplight, her eyes held depths he hadn't noticed before. "I told you. You told me what you believed I needed to hear. What you told Hjalmar, but I'm asking what you told yourself when you made the choice." For the first time since he'd known her, Solveig hesitated. She fingered the wooden cross again, as if drawing strength from its familiar weight. "I've spent my life healing people," she said finally. "Mending what's broken, easing what hurts, fighting death wherever I find it. But I've never—" She paused, searching for words. "I'd never had the chance to heal something truly significant. To take someone who had become lost and help them find their way back to who they were meant to be. And you think that's me?" Jorund's voice was barely above a whisper. "I think you could be," she replied, "if you wanted to be badly enough." The ship rocked gently in the night swells, carrying them toward whatever fate awaited at Hjalmar's stronghold. Around them, warriors slept or stood watch, while above them the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns. Indifferent to human suffering and hope, Jorund closed his eyes and tried to remember the last time he had wanted to be anything other than what necessity had made him. The memory was there, buried beneath years of cynicism and violence, but still breathing faintly like coals beneath ash. When he opened his eyes again, Solveig was still watching him, and he realized that for the first time in longer than he could remember, someone was looking at him and seeing possibility rather than just danger. The wooden cross at her throat caught the lamplight and threw tiny shadows across her face. And Jorund found himself wondering if redemption might be something more than just a comforting story told by people who had never truly fallen. Hjalmar's fortress rose from a rocky promontory like a giant's fist thrust skyward, its wooden walls and towers commanding views of both sea and inland valleys. It was an impressive stronghold, built for war, but also for displaying the wealth and power of its master. As their ship approached the heavily fortified harbor, Jorund could see the evidence of Hjalmar's success: multiple longships at anchor, bustling workshops and armories, and the general air of prosperity that came from years of successful raiding. The Great Hall itself was a monument to conquest, its walls lined with captured weapons, banners from defeated enemies, and the skulls of those who had opposed Hjalmar over the years. Yet, as they were escorted inside, Jorund noticed something else: a faded family portrait tapestry hanging in a place of honor above the high seat. The weaving depicted a younger Hjalmar with a woman and two small children, all rendered in the careful detail that spoke of deep affection. The sight of that tapestry hit Jorund like a physical blow. His own family tapestry had been burned years ago, destroyed in the same raid that had taken his wife Astrid and son Magnus. He had convinced himself that forgetting was easier than remembering, but seeing Hjalmar's preserved memories forced him to confront the magnitude of his own loss. "You noticed the family portrait," Hjalmar said, following Jorund's gaze as they were brought before his throne. "My wife and children, dead these 15 years from the wasting sickness. Nothing I could do to save them. No amount of gold or strength of arm could fight that particular enemy." The pain in Hjalmar's voice was unmistakable, and Jorund found himself seeing his longtime enemy in a new light. They were both men who had lost everything that mattered, who had filled the emptiness with violence and the pursuit of power because it was easier than facing the silence of empty halls. "I'm sorry for your loss," Jorund said, and was surprised to discover he meant it. As I am for yours, Hjalmar replied, his eyes sharp with understanding. Yes, I know about Astrid and Magnus. How could I not? We've been circling each other like wounded wolves for years, Jorund. We probably have more in common than either of us cares to admit. Solveig watched this exchange with growing comprehension. These two warriors, locked in bitter enmity, were really two sides of the same tragic storymen who had responded to unbearable loss by becoming something harder and more terrible than they had ever intended to be. Then why, she began, but Hjalmar raised a hand to stop her. Why continue the blood feud if we understand each other so well? He gestured to the scars that mapped his face and arms. Because understanding doesn't erase the injuries, healer. Your precious Jorund burned my hall, killed my sworn men, destroyed 3 years of careful alliances. Understanding his pain doesn't heal mine. But it could be a beginning, Solveig said quietly. Pain shared is pain halved, my mother used to say. Hjalmar laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Your mother never lost everything to raiders. I'd wager. Pretty words won't resurrect the dead or rebuild what's been destroyed. No, Solveig agreed. But they might prevent future destruction. How many more must die before this feud is satisfied? How many more families must lose their fathers and sons to keep this hatred alive? The question hung in the air like incense smoke, heavy with implications. Jorund found himself studying the tapestry again, remembering his own wife's skill with needle and thread, the way she had captured their family's happiness in wool and dye for posterity. Your family, he said to Hjalmar. They were beautiful. Your wife had kind eyes. She did. Hjalmar's voice softened slightly. She used to say that kindness was the only weapon that could defeat cruelty. I thought her naive then. Now, he gestured around the hall filled with trophies of war. Now I wonder if she might have been the wisest of us all. Solveig seized on this opening. Then perhaps her wisdom could guide us now. I've seen enough of war to know that victory is usually just another word for everyone loses differently. But I've also seen enough healing to know that even the deepest wounds can mend, given time and proper care. You would treat this feud like a disease? Hjalmar asked, his tone more curious than mocking. I would treat it like what it is, a festering wound that keeps reopening because no one has properly cleaned it and allowed it to heal. Jorund looked at her with new respect. She was doing something he had never seen before, applying the logic of healing to the practice of war. It was either brilliant or completely mad, and he wasn't sure which. Over the following days, their strange captivity settled into an unexpected routine. Solveig was given the freedom to practice her healing arts among Hjalmar's people, many of whom suffered from various ailments that had gone untreated. Her skill and gentle manner quickly earned her a reputation as someone valuable beyond her role as a prisoner. Jorund, meanwhile, found himself in the peculiar position of being a captive consultant. Hjalmar, it turned out, was facing problems that required the kind of strategic thinking that had made Jorund legendary. Rival chieftains were forming alliances, trade routes were being disrupted, and the delicate balance of power that kept the region stable was beginning to shift. Your advice, Hjalmar said one evening as they shared ale in the great hall. If you were in my position, how would you respond to Olaf the Stout's increasing aggression? Jorund considered the question seriously. Despite their history, he found himself genuinely interested in the strategic puzzle. Olaf's strength comes from his ability to unite smaller chiefs under his banner, divide those alliances, offer better terms to his least loyal followers, force him to fight on multiple fronts instead of concentrating his forces. Sound advice? Hjalmar acknowledged. The same kind of thinking that made you such a dangerous enemy, or could make me a valuable ally, Jorund said quietly. The words surprised both men. The idea of alliance instead of vengeance was so foreign to their long relationship that it seemed almost impossible to contemplate. Solveig, who had been quietly mending clothing nearby, looked up with something that might have been hope in her eyes. "Imagine what you could accomplish together, instead of spending your strength trying to destroy each other," she said. "The tapestry shows what you were both fighting to protect. Perhaps it's time to start building again, instead of just tearing down." That night, as Jorund lay on his sleeping furs, he found himself staring at the portrait tapestry and remembering things he had tried to forget. Astrid's laughter, Magnus's pride in his first successful hunt, the simple joy of a family gathered around their own hearth. For the first time in years, the memories brought more comfort than pain, as if Solveig's presence had somehow given him permission to remember love instead of just loss. The ancient runestone fragment sat in Hjalmar's private chamber like a piece of frozen time, its carved surface worn smooth by centuries of wind and weather. The symbols etched into the granite were old beyond memory, predating even the earliest sagas, and their meaning had been debated by skalds and wise men for generations. Jorund found himself drawn to the artifact during his third week of captivity, when Hjalmar had begun allowing him greater freedom within the fortress walls. The fragment was perhaps the size of a man's torso, covered in intricate carvings that seemed to shift and flow in the lamplight. "Can you read it?" Solveig asked, joining him in the quiet chamber. Her healing work had earned her similar privileges, and she had taken to spending her free time exploring the fortress and learning about its inhabitants. "Some of it," Jorund replied, tracing one of the symbols with his finger. "This part speaks of journeys and choices. This section here, it's about the price of power, the burden that comes with commanding others. And this?" She pointed to a section near the bottom, where the carving was particularly deep and clear. Jorund studied the runes carefully. "Something about renewal? Rebirth?" "The old language is difficult, and these symbols are older still. But I think it speaks of the possibility of becoming something new, even when you believe your path is already carved in stone." Solveig smiled slightly. Perhaps whoever carved this understood something about second chances. Or perhaps they understood that all men eventually face the same choice, whether to remain prisoners of what they've been or find the courage to become what they might yet be. The words surprised Jorund, even as he spoke them. When had he become the kind of man who spoke of courage and possibility? The old Jorund would have seen only weakness in such thoughts, but lately he found himself questioning many of the certainties that had once defined his world. "Hjalmar says you've been giving him good counsel," Solveig said, settling on a bench nearby. "His captains speak of you with respect rather than just fear. That's quite an accomplishment for a prisoner." "Strange, isn't it?" Jorund mused. "I spent 30 years thinking that respect could only come through intimidation. But here, stripped of my weapons and my army, I find people listening to my words rather than just obeying my commands. Perhaps they're hearing your wisdom for the first time instead of just your anger." Jorund considered this, his gaze returning to the runestone. "Wisdom, another word I would have scorned in my younger days. I thought wisdom was for old men who had grown too weak to fight. And now? Now I wonder if wisdom might be what strong men discover when they finally grow tired of fighting meaningless battles." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of one of Hjalmar's scouts, a young man named Thorvald, whose usual confidence had been replaced by obvious worry. "Lord Hjalmar requests your presence in the great hall," he said to Jorund. "Both of you. There's been troubling news." They found Hjalmar standing before a great map spread across his planning table, surrounded by his war leaders and several grim-faced messengers. The fortress's entire leadership seemed to be present, and the atmosphere was tense with barely controlled anger. "Olaf the Stout has made his move," Hjalmar announced without preamble. "3 of my allied chiefs have been murdered in their beds: Gunnar Iron Arm, Eric Wave Rider, and Bjorn the Bold. Their halls have been burned, their people scattered or enslaved. The news hit the assembled warriors like a physical blow. These were not minor chieftains, but established leaders whose alliances formed the backbone of Hjalmar's regional power. How? Demanded Ragnar, who had recovered enough from his wounds to participate in such councils. Those were strongholds, well defended. Treachery, Hjalmar replied grimly. Someone gave Olaf information about their defenses, their routines, their weaknesses. This wasn't random raiding, it was calculated assassination. Jorund studied the map, his strategic mind already working through the implications. He's not just eliminating your allies, he said slowly. He's sending a message. Submit or die in submission won't guarantee safety anyway. Precisely. Hjalmar's eyes were hard as winter iron, which means we face a choice. Bend the knee to a madman, or prepare for a war we may not be able to win. There's a third option, Solveig said quietly, causing everyone in the hall to turn toward her. Her presence at a war council was unusual enough to command attention, and her words carried the weight of someone who had thought carefully before speaking. The woman speaks of war now? Sneered one of Hjalmar's captains, a scarred veteran named Ulf, who had little patience for what he saw as feminine interference. I speak of survival, she replied calmly. And I speak of justice. Olaf has declared war on the very idea of honorable leadership. He's not just your enemy, he's everyone's enemy. The question is whether you'll face him alone or find a way to unite everyone who has reason to oppose him. Hjalmar leaned forward, his attention fully focused on her words. Continue. You and Jorund have been enemies for years, but look at what you've accomplished in just a few weeks of cooperation. Imagine what you could achieve if that cooperation extended beyond these walls. How many other chiefs are watching Olaf's rise with growing fear? How many would join an alliance strong enough to stand against him? An alliance led by whom? Ulf demanded. Hjalmar and his pet prisoner? An alliance led by wisdom instead of pride, Jorund said, surprising himself by defending Solveig's idea. She's right. Olaf's strength comes from dividing his enemies, making each of us believe we stand alone. But if we could unite the threatened chiefs, present a unified front, you would trust former enemies to watch your back? Ragnar asked, skeptically. I would trust shared interests to motivate shared actions, Jorund replied. Fear can be as strong a bond as friendship when the threat is great enough. Hjalmar was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between the map and the faces of his advisors. Finally, he straightened and looked directly at Jorund. If I were to consider such an alliance hypothetically, what would you ask in return? For your counsel and cooperation? The question hung in the air like smoke from a signal fire. Jorund felt the weight of every eye in the room, the awareness that his answer would determine not just his own fate, but potentially the future of the entire region. Freedom for myself and my surviving men, he said finally, and protection for Solveig, regardless of what happens to me. That's all? Jorund glanced at the runestone fragment visible through the chamber's open door, its ancient symbols promising transformation for those brave enough to choose change over continuity. That's enough, he said. Some prices are worth paying for the chance to become something better than what you've been. The broken chainmail lay spread across Solveig's lap like a metallic skin shed by some great beast. Each ring had been carefully crafted by a master smith, but months of hard campaigning had taken their toll. Links were cracked, sections had pulled apart, and rust had begun its inevitable work of returning iron to earth. Jorund sat nearby, stripped to his linen shirt, watching her work with the concentrated attention of someone discovering a new form of magic. Her fingers moved with practiced precision, testing each link, sorting the salvageable from the hopeless, beginning the slow process of restoration. You don't have to do this, he said for the third time since she had begun the work. It's not. A healer's task, isn't it? She held up a particularly damaged section to the lamplight, examining it critically. What is healing but the art of mending what's been broken? Whether it's flesh or iron, the principle remains the same: clean the damage, remove what can't be saved, and carefully join what remains. They have been working together for 2 hours now, ever since the War Council had concluded with Hjalmar's grudging agreement to consider the alliance proposal. The atmosphere in the fortress had shifted subtly, as if the very stones were adjusting to the possibility of cooperation instead of conquest. "Tell me about your village," Jorund said, handing her another section of mail. "Before the raid." "What was your life like?" Solveig's hands paused in their work. "Peaceful," she said after a moment. "Perhaps too peaceful. I sometimes felt like I was waiting for something to begin, some purpose beyond tending scraped knees and birthing babies. And now? Now I think I might have found it." She looked at him directly, her eyes reflecting the lamplight. "Not in the way I expected, certainly. But perhaps that's how the most important purposes reveal themselves, not as grand designs we choose, but as necessary actions we discover ourselves capable of taking." Jorund reached for his wine cup, a gesture that sent a sharp reminder of pain through his healing side. Solveig noticed immediately, setting aside the mail to examine his bandages with professional concern. "The wound is healing well," she said, her touch gentle but thorough. "But you're pushing too hard, too fast. Healing requires patience, a virtue not commonly associated with Viking chieftains." "Former chieftain," he corrected. "I'm not sure what I am anymore." "You're a man trying to become something better than what he was," she replied, rewrapping the bandage with careful precision. "That's harder and more important than being any kind of chieftain." As she worked, Jorund found himself studying her face in the flickering light. There were lines around her eyes that spoke of laughter as well as sorrow, a strength in her features that had nothing to do with physical power and everything to do with moral courage. "Why didn't you marry?" he asked suddenly, then immediately regretted the personal nature of the question. But Solveig answered without apparent discomfort. "I was betrothed once to the son of a neighboring chief. A good man, kind and honorable. But he died in a raiding accident before we could wed. I'm sorry, don't be. We were young, and what we felt was affection rather than love. His death taught me that life is too short and too uncertain to settle for anything less than—" She paused, searching for words. "Then what?" "Then a connection. That changes both people involved. I decided I would rather remain alone than accept a merely pleasant marriage." Jorund nodded slowly. "I understand that choice. After Astrid died, there were opportunities for remarriage, political alliances, practical arrangements. But they all felt like betrayals of what we had shared." "What was she like?" The question surprised him with its gentleness. Most people either avoided the subject of his family entirely or approached it with the careful delicacy reserved for potentially explosive topics. "Strong," he said finally. "Not physically, she was small, delicate-looking, but strong here." He touched his chest above his heart. "She could make me feel like a better man just by believing I was one. Fun. When she looked at me, I saw myself as she saw me, someone worthy of love instead of merely fear. She sounds wonderful." She was. And Magnus, our son, he had her gift for seeing good in people. Even in me, during those last years when the good had become increasingly difficult to find. Solveig resumed her work on the chainmail, but her movements had slowed, become more thoughtful. "May I ask how you lost them?" Jorund was quiet for so long that she began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Disease. The wasting sickness that takes children and the elderly first. I was away on campaign when it struck our settlement. By the time I returned, he stopped, unable to continue. You couldn't save them. I couldn't even say goodbye. That was 15 years ago, and I still wake some mornings expecting to hear Magnus calling for me to take him fishing, or Astrid humming while she worked at her loom. Solveig set down the mail and moved closer to him, her expression infinitely compassionate. Is that when you stopped trying to be the man they believed you were? The question hit him like a physical blow, not because it was harsh, but because it was so accurate, it took his breath away. Yes, he admitted. It seemed easier to become something terrible than to remain something good without them to see it. But they would still see it, she said softly. If you believe they continue to exist somewhere beyond this life, then they would still see everything you choose to become. And if I don't believe that, then you carry their memory forward in everything you do. Either way, the choice of who to be remains yours. They sat in comfortable silence while she returned to her mending. The only sounds the soft clink of metal on metal and the distant conversations of the fortress's night watch. Jorund found himself watching her hands as they worked, admiring the skill and patience that transformed broken things into whole ones. Solveig, he said eventually. Yes, if we survive what's coming. If Hjalmar's alliance succeeds and Olaf is defeated, what then? She looked up from her work, meeting his eyes with an expression he couldn't quite read. Then we'll have the luxury of discovering who we choose to be when we're not fighting for our lives. And what would you choose? To continue healing, she said without hesitation, but perhaps on a larger scale than scraped knees and birthing babies. To help build something that lasts longer than the next raid or the next winter. With me? The question hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. But when she answered, her voice was steady and sure. If you want to build something worth building, yes, with you. The blood-stained letter arrived with the dawn, carried by a raven whose dark wings had been clipped to prevent its escape. The bird settled on the fortress walls with the exhausted heaviness of something that had flown through the night, and the message it bore would shatter the fragile peace that had been growing between former enemies. Hjalmar read the letter first, his face growing progressively paler as he absorbed its contents. Then he read it again, as if hoping the words might change on second viewing. Finally, he looked up at the assembled war council, his expression grim with implications none of them had foreseen. It's from Olaf, he announced, holding up the parchment so all could see the dark stains that marked its surface. Written in the blood of Chief Gunnar's youngest son, if his claims are true. A collective intake of breath filled the great hall. Using blood as ink was an ancient practice reserved for the most serious oaths and the most terrible threats. It spoke of complete abandonment of civilized convention, a declaration that normal rules no longer applied. What are his terms? Jorund asked, though something in Hjalmar's manner suggested this was about more than simple negotiation. He offers a temporary truce, Hjalmar replied slowly. In exchange for the return of a single prisoner he claims rightfully belongs to him. Solveig felt ice form in her stomach. Which prisoner? Hjalmar's eyes found hers across the room, and she saw something there she had never expected to see: pity mixed with a terrible understanding. He calls you Solveig Eric's daughter, Hjalmar said gently. Daughter of Eric the Bold, last surviving. Heir to the bloodline of the western fjords. The silence that followed was so complete that the guttering of torches sounded like thunder. Solveig stared at Hjalmar as if he had spoken in a foreign tongue, her mind refusing to process the implications of what she had just heard. That's impossible, she whispered. My father was Olaf the Gentle, a village healer. He died of fever when I was 12. The man who raised you, perhaps, Hjalmar said with infinite compassion. But according to this letter and certain details, that ring unfortunately true. Your birth father was Eric the Bold, who ruled the western settlements until he was killed in battle 5 years ago. Jorund felt the world tilt around him as memory crashed over him like a wave. 5 years ago, the western fjords. A pitched battle on a muddy field where he had faced a chieftain known for his golden hair and fierce courage. Where he had driven his sword through a brave man's heart and watched the life fade from eyes that had been the same startling blue as Solveig's. No, he breathed, the word torn from him like a physical wound. But Hjalmar was still reading, his voice taking on the relentless quality of fate itself. Olaf claims that Eric's infant daughter was spirited away before the final battle, hidden with loyal retainers who were instructed to raise her as their own. He says he has spent years tracking down the bloodline, eliminating potential claimants. Terror Eric's territory and treasure. Solveig's hands went to her throat, where a silver pendant had hung for as long as she could remember. Her foster father had given it to her, claiming it was her birth mother's only legacy. She had never thought to question the story, accepting it as one accepts the color of sky or the turning of seasons. The pendant, Hjalmar said, noticing her gesture. Does it bear the mark of the raven and the oak? With trembling fingers, Solveig pulled the necklace from beneath her dress. The silver was old and worn smooth, but the carved symbols were still clearly visible, a raven perched on an oak branch, the ancient sigil of Eric's line. Jorund closed his eyes, remembering with perfect clarity the moment when he had torn a similar pendant from Eric the Bold's neck as the man lay dying. He had kept it as a trophy for months before finally casting it into the sea, unable to bear the weight of what it represented. Jorund? Solveig's voice seemed to come from very far away. You know something about this. I can see it in your face. He opened his eyes and met her gaze, seeing his own reflection there, a man who had spent 5 years trying to forget the look of recognition in a dying warrior's eyes. The way Eric had whispered a woman's name and then a single word, daughter. I killed him, Jorund said, the words falling into the silence like stones into still water. Eric the Bold, your father. I killed him in single combat during a territorial dispute 5 years ago. The blood-stained letter fluttered from Hjalmar's fingers as Solveig stared at Jorund with an expression that progressed from disbelief to horror to something approaching madness. She couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't form words around the magnitude of what she had just learned. He fought bravely, Jorund continued, his voice hollow with the weight of memory. He died with honor, calling out names I didn't understand at the time. A woman's name, probably your birth mother. And then he said, daughter, just before. Stop. Solveig's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through his words like a blade. Just stop. The great hall had become so quiet that every person present could hear the sound of their own heartbeat. Warriors who had faced death in 100 battles found themselves unable to meet anyone's eyes, as if witnessing something too private and terrible for public consumption. Agnar, who had been silent throughout the revelation, finally spoke. The blood feud, he said slowly. If she's Eric's daughter, then by law, she has the right to demand blood price for her father's death, Hjalmar finished, or to exact vengeance with her own hand. Solveig stood slowly, her movements careful and precise, as if she were walking across ice that might crack at any moment. She looked at Jorund, really looked at him, as if seeing him for the first time. All these weeks, she said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. All these conversations about redemption and second chances and becoming something better. I've been healing the man who orphaned me. She stopped, her hand going to her mouth, as if to prevent words she might regret. I've been falling in love with my father's killer. The admission hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Jorund felt something die inside his chest, some fragile hope he hadn't even realized he'd been nurturing. Solveig, don't. She held up a hand to stop him. Don't say my name. Don't try to explain or justify or ask for forgiveness. Not yet. I need time to understand what this means. She turned to Hjalmar, her posture straightening as she seemed to draw on reserves of strength that surprised everyone present. "The letter," she said. "What exactly does Olaf want?" "He wants you returned to him, alive and unharmed. In exchange, he'll cease his attacks on my allies and withdraw his forces to his own territories. And if you refuse, then he'll burn everything between here and the sea and hunt you down anyway. He claims you're the key to legitimizing his control over the western settlements as Eric's daughter. Your marriage to him would give legal weight to his conquest." Solveig closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, Jorund saw something there that chilled him more than hatred ever could cold calculation. The look of someone making impossible choices with ruthless pragmatism. "How long do we have to decide?" "He gives us 3 days to consider his offer. After that, he comes anyway," Jorund said, finding his voice again. "This isn't really a negotiation. It's a countdown." Solveig nodded slowly, then turned to face the assembled warriors with the bearing of someone who had been born to command, even if she'd never known it. "Then we use those 3 days wisely," she said, "because I'll be damned if I let that butcher use my father's blood to legitimize his reign of terror." She looked directly at Jorund then, and he saw something in her eyes that was neither love nor hatred, but something far more complex and dangerous. "We finish this," she said. "All of it. The blood feud, Olaf's ambitions, and whatever lies between. U.S. But we finish it on our terms, not his." As she strode from the hall, leaving behind a room full of stunned warriors, Jorund realized that the woman he had fallen in love with was gone forever. In her place stood someone harder, more complex, and infinitely more dangerous, a woman who knew exactly who she was and what that knowledge would cost them all. The silver pendant lay on the rough wooden table like an accusation made manifest, its ancient symbols catching the firelight and throwing shadows that seemed to writhe with a life of their own. Solveig sat across from it in Hjalmar's private chamber, having requested this meeting away from the prying eyes and listening ears that filled the fortress. Jorund sat opposite her, the space between them feeling wider than the greatest fjord. 3 days had passed since the revelation of her true parentage, 3 days during which they had spoken only when necessity demanded it. Now, with Olaf's deadline approaching like an inevitable storm, they could no longer afford the luxury of avoiding each other. "I remember him," she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not clearly, but sometimes in dreams I see a man with golden hair who smells like leather and wood smoke. He would lift me up and call me his little raven, his treasure." Jorund's hands clenched involuntarily. He had taken that treasured child's father from her, had made her an orphan with his own blade. The knowledge sat in his stomach like a stone, cold and unforgiving. "He fought to protect you," Jorund said carefully. "Even as he lay dying, he spoke your name. You were his last thought." "Was it quick?" The question was asked without emotion, as if she were inquiring about the weather. "Yes. He felt no pain at the end. It was a lie, but a merciful one. Eric the Bold had died hard, as warriors often did, but Jorund saw no purpose in burdening his daughter with that truth." Solveig nodded slowly, then reached for the pendant. Her fingers traced the carved raven with the same gentle precision she brought to healing wounds. "The foster parents who raised me," she continued. "They were good people, kind. They never told me the truth because they knew it would only bring danger. A dead chieftain's daughter has value to the wrong sort of men. Men like Olaf." "Men like Olaf," she agreed. "And men like—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "Men like me," Jorund completed for her. "Yes, I would have used you just as ruthlessly in my younger days. Your bloodline would have been a weapon to be wielded, not a person to be protected. And now?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Jorund met her eyes steadily, knowing that everything they might yet become depended on his answer. Now I would die before letting any harm come to you, regardless of whose daughter you are. What I feel for you has nothing to do with your bloodline and everything to do with who you've chosen to become. The daughter of the man you killed. The woman who chose to save a stranger's life rather than watch him die. The healer who sees possibility where others see only destruction. The person brave enough to believe that even the worst of us might become something better. Solveig was quiet for a long moment, her attention fixed on the pendant in her hands. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that made Jorund think of winter ice beginning to crack. "There's something else," she said. "Something I've been thinking about for 3 days, and I need to know if I'm right." "What?" "The wound in your side. The one that was infected when we first met. You said it came from a Frankish blade during your last campaign." Jorund nodded, though he was beginning to suspect where this line of questioning was heading. "But it wasn't from that campaign, was it?" She continued relentlessly. "The scar tissue is too old, the healing pattern wrong for a recent injury. That wound is at least 5 years old, maybe more." Jorund closed his eyes, knowing that denials would be useless. She had examined that wound too thoroughly, with too much professional expertise, to be fooled by convenient lies. "You got it during the battle where you killed my father," she said with devastating certainty. "He wounded you, didn't he? Even as he was dying, he managed to hurt the man who was killing him." "Yes, good." The word was spoken with such quiet venom that it seemed to poison the air between them. "I'm glad he hurt you. I'm glad you've carried that pain for 5 years. I hope it aches every morning when you wake and every night before you sleep." Jorund accepted her words without flinching, knowing he deserved far worse. But when she continued, her voice took on a different quality, not softer, but more complex. "And I'm glad it brought you to my village. I'm glad it made you weak enough to need healing, vulnerable enough to let someone get close to you. Because without that wound, we never would have met. Without that pain, you might never have learned to become the man sitting across from me now." She set the pendant down on the table between them, the silver catching the light like captured. "Starfire, I've been trying to hate you," she said simply. "For 3 days, I've been trying to feel a rage and thirst for vengeance that should rightfully be mine. But every time I think about drawing a blade across your throat, I remember the way you looked when you spoke of your wife and son. I remember how you surrendered rather than let innocence die. I remember." She paused, struggling with words that seemed too large for her throat. "I remember falling in love with you." "Solveig, no, let me finish. I've been trying to hate you, but what I actually feel is something much more complicated. You killed my father, yes, but you also became the man my father would have wanted me to love. You grew from a killer into a protector, from someone who takes life into someone who preserves it. The irony is almost unbearable." She stood and moved to the chamber's single window, looking out at the courtyard, where Hjalmar's men were making their final preparations for battle. "Olaf will come tomorrow," she said. "With or without my cooperation, he'll come. And when he does, good people will die, people who've done nothing wrong except stand in the way of his ambitions." "We can fight him," Jorund said. "Hjalmar's alliance isn't strong enough," she interrupted. "Not yet. The other chiefs are still deciding whether to trust former enemies, still weighing the risks of open rebellion against Olaf's growing power. By the time they commit their forces, it will be too late." "Then, what do you propose?" Solveig turned back to face him, and Jorund saw something in her expression that reminded him powerfully of her father in the moments before their final battle. A pearl, combination of fear and determination that spoke of impossible choices being made for the right reasons. "I propose we give Olaf exactly what he thinks he wants," she said. "Me? Absolutely not. Listen before you refuse. Olaf wants me alive because my bloodline legitimizes his claims to the Western territories. But he also wants me compliant, grateful, for his protection, willing to play the role of rescued princess. What if instead he gets a daughter of Eric the Bold, who knows exactly who she is and what that means? Jorund began to understand the shape of her plan, and it terrified him more than any battlefield he had ever faced. You mean to kill him yourself? I mean to get close enough to try. At his wedding feast, when he's drunk on victory and surrounded by celebrating supporters. When his guard is down and mine is close to his heart. It's suicide. Maybe. But it's also the only chance we have to end this without watching hundreds of good people die in a war they can't win. Jorund stood and moved toward her, his hands reaching out as if to physically restrain her from the madness she was contemplating. There has to be another way. Some strategy we haven't considered, some alliance we haven't explored. There isn't. Her voice was gentle but implacable. You know there isn't. You've seen the numbers, studied the tactical situation. This is our best chance, maybe our only chance. I won't let you sacrifice yourself for my mistakes. This isn't about your mistakes anymore, she replied, taking his hands in hers. This is about choosing who we want to be when everything we've built is threatened. You taught me that, Jorund. You showed me that it's possible to become something better than what you were, no matter how dark your past might be. Not at this price. At any price that matters. She lifted the pendant from the table and fastened it around her neck, the silver settling against her throat like a collar of destiny. My father died trying to protect his people from men like Olaf. It seems fitting that his daughter should finish what he started. Outside, the first horn calls of the evening watch echoed across the fortress walls, a reminder that dawn would bring decisions that could no longer be postponed. Solveig moved closer to Jorund, close enough that he could see the silver pendant rise and fall with her breathing. If I don't survive this, she said quietly, I want you to know that loving you, even under these circumstances, even knowing what I know, has been the most real thing in my life. You helped me discover who I really am, not just whose daughter I happen to be. And if you do survive, then we'll build something worthy of the people we've become. Something that honors both your family's memory and my father's legacy. Something that proves love can be stronger than vengeance, even when vengeance would be justified. She kissed him then, a kiss that tasted of silver and sorrow and the terrible sweetness of love discovered at the worst possible moment. When they parted, Jorund saw his own reflection in her eyes and realized that tomorrow would either redeem them both or destroy. Everything they had dared to hope for. Dawn broke like a blade across the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood and iron. From the fortress walls, Jorund could see Olaf's fleet approaching 7 longships in perfect formation, their dragon prows cutting through the morning mist like the advance guard of Ragnarok itself, dot in his hands. He held his father's sword, the ancestral blade that had been passed down through 4 generations of his family. The steel was old, but still keen, its edge honed by decades of careful maintenance, its pommel worn smooth by the grip of his forefathers. It was a weapon that had seen honor and dishonor in equal measure, that had drawn blood in defense of home and family as well as in pursuit of conquest and gold. Today, it would help him choose which legacy to claim. They come in strength, Hjalmar observed, joining him at the ramparts. The other chieftain's face was grim but determined, the expression of a man who had made peace with necessary risks. At least 300 warriors, maybe more. Against our 150, Jorund replied, his tactical mind automatically assessing the odds. Poor mathematics for a siege, but we're not planning to endure one. Below them, the fortress courtyard bustled with final preparations. Warriors checked weapons and armor, while servants distributed what might be their last meal. In the center of it all, Solveig moved with calm purpose, her healer's satchel replaced by a simple traveling pack that held only the essentials for her terrible journey. She had dressed carefully for this day, not in the rough homespun she usually favored, but in a gown of deep blue wool that had belonged to Hjalmar's late wife. The fabric brought out the startling color of her eyes and lent her a dignity that was both regal and heartbreaking. Around her neck, the silver pendant caught the early light like a captured star. "She looks like her father," Hjalmar said quietly. Eric had that same bearing when he knew he was riding to his death proud, unafraid, ready to pay whatever price duty demanded. Jorund's grip tightened on his father's sword. "This is madness. There has to be another way. Perhaps. But not one that preserves more lives than it costs. She knows this, Jorund. And she's made her choice." The first of all of ships ground against the beach with a sound like splintering bones. Warriors poured over the sides in disciplined formations, their shields locked and their weapons ready. At their head strode Olaf himself, a giant of a man, whose reputation for cruelty was exceeded only by his reputation for cunning. He was younger than Jorund had expected, perhaps 40 years old, with the kind of brutal handsomeness that turned heads and stopped conversations. His armor was magnificent, polished steel chased with gold, and his weapons bore the mark of master smiths. Everything about him spoke of success, confidence, and the absolute certainty that the world existed to serve his ambitions. "Hjalmar, the Black," Olaf's voice carried easily across the distance between ship and shore. "I come under truce banner to collect what belongs to me. And what exactly do you believe belongs to you?" Hjalmar called back, though they all knew the answer. "Eric's daughter, the last legitimate heir to the Western territories. My future bride and the mother of my dynasty." The casual possessiveness in Olaf's tone made Jorund's blood burn, but he forced himself to remain calm. Rage would serve no purpose. Now only cold calculation could help Solveig survive what was coming. "The lady is free to choose her own path," Hjalmar replied. "If she wishes to come with you, I will not prevent it, but neither will I surrender her against her will." Olaf's laughter echoed off the fortress walls like the sound of breaking glass. "Her will? She's a woman, and a young one at that. Her will is whatever serves the needs of stronger men." It was then that Solveig herself appeared on the ramparts, visible to both armies. She stood straight and proud, the morning wind stirring her golden hair like a battle banner. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly across the beach and up to the walls where both friend and enemy could hear. "I am Solveig Eric's daughter," she announced, using her true name publicly for the first time in her life. "Daughter of Eric the Bold, heir to the western settlements, and granddaughter of chiefs who ruled these fjords when your grandfather was still learning to hold a sword." Olaf's expression shifted from amusement to something more predatory. "Then you know why I've come. I know you believe my bloodline gives weight to your claims of conquest. I know you think marriage to me will legitimize your rule over lands that were never yours to take. And I know you're intelligent enough to understand the alternative to willing cooperation." Solveig nodded slowly. "Complete destruction of everyone who has shown me kindness." "Yes, I understand your terms perfectly." She paused, her gaze finding Jorund among the defenders. For just a moment, her composed mask slipped, and he saw the fear and love and desperate hope that she was hiding from the world. "I will come with you," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was agreeing to. "But I have terms of my own." The burning longship lit the sky like a funeral pyre for the old ways, its flames reaching toward the heavens as if seeking to carry messages to the gods themselves. Jorund watched his vessel, the ship that had carried him across countless seas in pursuit of gold and glory, disappear into smoke and ash, and felt something fundamental shift inside his soul. The battle had raged for 3 hours, since Solveig's surrender had proven to be anything but submission. Her terms had been simple and devastating. She would come willingly only if Olaf faced Hjalmar in single combat, with the winner taking both her hand and control of the allied territories. It was an ancient challenge that no chieftain could refuse without losing face, and Olaf's pride had trapped him as surely as any snare. But pride, Jorund had learned, was a double-edged weapon. The single combat had lasted less than 10 minutes. Hjalmar, despite his years and injuries, had proven that experience could triumph over youth when properly applied. Olaf lay dead on the beach, his magnificent armor no protection against a blade guided by wisdom rather than rage. That should have ended it. But Olaf's lieutenants had other ideas. Treachery. Ragnar the Bloodaxe had screamed, Olaf's second in command, and a man whose reputation for brutality rivaled his dead leaders. The woman used sorcery to weaken our chief. We'll have her blood in the heads of every man who shelters her. The truce had shattered like ice in spring, and what followed was not the clean resolution of single combat, but the chaos of desperate men fighting for survival. Olaf's forces, driven by rage at their leader's death and fear of what would happen to them without his protection, threw themselves at the fortress with the fury of the doomed. But something had changed during those weeks of captivity and alliance. Hjalmar's men no longer fought alone. Beside them stood Jorund's surviving warriors, former enemies now bound together by shared purpose and mutual respect. The Gila woman who had taught them all to see beyond their ancient hatreds was worth protecting, and that protection was worth dying for. Jorund found himself fighting alongside men who had once tried to kill him, sharing shield walls with warriors who had learned to trust his tactical judgment despite their history. His father's sword sang through the air with deadly precision, but each stroke was guided by purpose rather than bloodlust. Near the harbor, Ragnar the Bloodaxe rallied his remaining forces for a final assault. The man was a berserker in the truest sense, foam flecking his lips as he called upon Odin for strength to avenge his fallen lord. Around him gathered the most fanatical of Olaf's followers, men who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. "The witch dies today," Ragnar bellowed, pointing his gore-stained axe toward where Solveig tended wounded warriors near the fortress gates. "And every man who stands with her." But as the berserkers charged forward, something unexpected happened. The allied forces didn't break or retreat. Instead, they closed ranks with the disciplined precision of veterans who had learned to fight as one. Hjalmar's tactical genius combined with Jorund's battlefield experience had created something new. An army that fought not for conquest but for protection, not for gold but for the right to build something better than endless warfare. The clash, when it came, was brief but decisive. Ragnar fell with Jorund's father's sword through his heart. His berserker rage no match for cold steel guided by clear purpose. Around him, his followers died or fled, their fanaticism crumbling in the face of united opposition as the last of Olaf's ships burned in the harbor. Jorund stood on the beach where so much blood had been spilled and looked at the weapon in his hands. His father's sword bore the stains of this final battle, but somehow those stains felt different from all the others. This blood had been shed in defense rather than conquest, in protection of something precious rather than pursuit of something valuable. Solveig found him there as the sun reached its zenith, her healer's dress stained with the blood of men from both sides whom she had tried to save. Her face was drawn with exhaustion, but her eyes held a light that spoke of victory achieved at acceptable cost. "It's over," she said simply. "This part of it," Jorund agreed. "But what comes next?" She gestured toward the fortress where survivors from both armies worked together to tend the wounded and repair the damage. Former enemies shared water and bread, bound together by the understanding that they had all fought for something larger than their individual grievances. "We'd build," she said. "We'd take all this energy that's been wasted on destruction and use it to create something that lasts. Schools and hospitals, trade routes and libraries. We prove that strength can serve more than just the strong. Jorund nodded slowly, then walked to where the burning longship cast its light across the water. With deliberate ceremony, he drew back his arm and hurled his father's sword far out into the fjord, watching it disappear beneath the waves with barely a splash. "Why?" Solveig asked. "Because some legacies are worth more than the weapons that made them," he replied. "And because the man I want to become doesn't need to carry steel to prove his worth." The burning ship collapsed into the waves with a great hiss of steam, taking with it the last visible symbol of Jorund's whole life. In its place, something new began to take shape, not perfect, not without challenges, but possible in ways that violence alone could never achieve. 2 years later, the trading settlement of Erikshaven bustled with life in ways its founders had never dared imagine. Built on the site where Solveig's father had once ruled, the community had grown from a handful of survivors into a thriving center of commerce and learning that drew visitors from across the northern lands. The morning sun fell across the settlements. Hard, where a modest wooden hall served as both meeting place and symbol of the new way of life they had built together. Above its doors, 2 artifacts hung side by side in carved wooden holders, a wooden cross and Thor's hammer, representing the different faiths that had learned to coexist in this place where cooperation mattered more than uniformity. Jorund stood in the doorway of that hall, watching the daily rhythms of a community at peace with itself. Former Vikings worked alongside former enemies. Their children played together without regard for their parents' histories, and disputes were settled with words and compromise rather than swords and blood. At 58, he looked older than his years, but somehow more solid, as if the weight he had carried for so long had finally settled into something sustainable. His hair had gone completely gray, and lines mapped his face like the memory of old battles. But his eyes held a peace that would have been unrecognizable to the man who had once terrorized these same fjords. "Admiring your handiwork?" Solveig asked, joining him in the doorway. At 28, she had grown into her role as the settlement's leader with a natural grace that reminded everyone who knew the stories of her father's legendary fairness. The silver pendant still hung at her throat, but now it was complemented by a simple gold band on her finger, the mark of a marriage. That had surprised no one and pleased everyone. "Our handiwork," Jorund corrected, taking her hand in his. "I provide the tactical planning. You provide the vision that makes it worth implementing." She smiled, the expression transforming her face with the same radiance that had first caught his attention in a distant village that seemed like another lifetime. "And between us, we've managed to prove that former enemies can become something more than just reluctant allies." Speaking of which, Jorund nodded toward the harbor where a familiar dragon-prowed ship was making its approach. Hjalmar's early for the council meeting. The quarterly gathering of allied chiefs had become one of Erikshaven's most important traditions, a time when the leaders of a dozen settlements came together to resolve disputes, plan joint ventures, and reinforce the bonds that kept their alliance strong. What had begun as a military necessity had evolved into something approaching a primitive parliament, with Solveig and Jorund serving as neutral arbitrators when agreements proved difficult to reach. Hjalmar himself had aged gracefully into the role of elder statesman, his fierce reputation tempered by the wisdom that came from seeing alternatives to endless warfare. His own settlement had prospered under the Alliance's protection, and his advice was sought by chiefs throughout the region. "He's brought guests," Solveig observed, pointing to the figures disembarking from Hjalmar's ship. "Young ones by the look of them." Indeed, among Hjalmar's usual retinue were several men and women who appeared to be in their 20s, potential leaders, being introduced to the ways of peaceful cooperation. Jorund suspected it was a practice that had become common among the allied settlements, a deliberate effort to ensure that the next generation understood alternatives to their parents' conflicts. "Do you think it will last?" Solveig asked suddenly, her tone carrying the weight of someone who had invested everything in a single vision of the future. Jorund considered the question seriously. Around them, the settlement continued its daily business, merchants haggling over prices, craftsmen teaching apprentices, mothers tending children who had never known the terror of unexpected raids. It was ordinary, domestic, utterly unremarkable. By the standards of saga and legend, it was also miraculous. "I think," he said slowly, "that we've given it the best chance possible. We've shown that cooperation can be more profitable than conquest, that building lasts longer than raiding, that strength can serve more than just the strong. Whether future generations choose to continue what we've started, that's up to them. And if they don't, then at least we'll have proven it was possible. Sometimes that's enough to demonstrate that another way exists, even if people aren't ready to choose it permanently." A child's laughter echoed across the settlement square, where a group of youngsters played a game that seemed to involve considerable running and shouting. Among them, Jorund noticed, were children whose parents had once been mortal enemies, now united in the universal conspiracy of youth against the incomprehensible behaviors of adults. "They give me hope," Solveig said, following his gaze. "Because they don't remember the hatred. Because they're creating new memories. Look at them. They're not thinking about their father's feuds or their mother's losses. They're just being children together, learning that friendship is possible between people their parents thought could never trust each other." As if summoned by their attention, one of the children, a girl of perhaps 8 with Solveig's golden hair and her own determined expression, broke away from the group and ran toward them. "Mama Solveig," she called, using the title that half the settlement's children had adopted for the woman who served as healer, teacher, and surrogate mother to anyone who needed it. "Papa Jorund said you would tell us the story about the dragon who learned to tend gardens instead of hoarding gold." Jorund raised an eyebrow. "I said that, did I?" "You said it was about a scary man who became kind," the girl continued with the relentless logic of childhood. "And Mama Solveig tells the best stories about scary things becoming good things." Solveig laughed, the sound carrying across the square like the ringing of silver bells. "Well, if Papa Jorund promised a story, then a story you shall have. But first, we need to greet our guests properly." As they walked toward the harbor to welcome Hjalmar and his delegation, Jorund reflected on the strange turns that life could take. 2 years ago, he had been a feared chieftain whose name was spoken in whispers and whose future seemed to hold nothing but violence and eventual death in battle. He was Papa Jorund to a dozen children who would never know the fear that had defined his own youth, husband to a woman who had taught him that love could indeed conquer hatred, and co-founder of a community that proved daily that former enemies could become family. The silver pendant caught the light as Solveig moved beside him, and the wooden cross and Thor's hammer above their hall stood as silent testimony to the forest of a possibility of unity despite difference. It wasn't perfect. No human endeavor ever was, but it was good and growing better, and built on foundations strong enough to last. Sometimes, Jorund thought, as they reached the harbor where old allies waited with new friends, that was enough. Sometimes, that was everything.